This is Apropos. Well, the court has been under the spotlight since issuing arrest warrants over the war in Gaza. The president of the ICC is hitting out at attacks that have been made against it since judges granted a request to issue arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister and his former defence minister. She's condemned the US and Russia for interfering with the court's investigations, as Morgan Eyre explains.
The ICC is being treated like a terrorist organisation. That was how President Judge Tomoko Akane described the threats being levelled at the court. She did not specifically mention Russia or the United States by name as the countries putting pressure on the ICC, but she implied them by referring to permanent members of the UN Security Council.
The court has been subjected to attacks seeking to undermine its legitimacy and ability to administer justice and realize international law and fundamental rights by coercive measures, threats, pressure, and acts of sabotage. Several elected officials are being severely threatened and are subjected to arrest warrants.
Russia issued an arrest warrant for the court's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, 2 months after the institution issued a warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin. In June, the US House of Representatives passed a bill to sanction the ICC. This was in response to the court's arrest warrant against Israeli Prime Minister Binyamin Netanyahu and his former defence chief, Yoav Gallant. Neither country is a member of the ICC, but US sanctions could significantly weaken it politically and diplomatically.
It's clear by any metric, by any benchmark, this assembly is at a pivotal time. We are facing unprecedented challenges.
The court was established in 2002 to prosecute war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide when member states are unwilling or unable to do so themselves. It requires member states to execute its arrest warrants. A few countries in Europe, along with the US, have publicly said they would not adhere to the warrant against Netanyahu. Some experts have warned that such moves could lead towards the unravelling of the ICC's statute system.
To discuss further, we're joined now by Anthony Dworkin, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Good to have you with us this evening. Anthony, as we saw there, the ICC holding its annual meeting as it comes under pushback over those arrest warrants issued for Israeli officials. Just how much political pressure is the court coming under at the moment?
Well, the court, I think, is entering the period where it's going to face the most intense political pressure that it has faced since it was set up more than 2 decades ago. And, you know, this is a court which by its nature is used to working in political situations. But I think what we have now with the attacks not only from Russia, but particularly important, I think, is the risk of a full-scale attack from the United States against the International Criminal Court after Donald Trump takes office in the White House in January. I mean, this is a court which has traditionally been backed and funded by Western powers, not the United States itself, but many of the United States' closest allies in Europe and in Asia. And I think a campaign from the US, you know, against the court, particularly if it tries to extend that to American allies, could put the court in a very difficult position. But having said that, I think it's also important to say that in many ways, this is the court doing what it's supposed to do. And, you know, the court is here operating without fear or favor. And I think that could, in some ways, despite the pressure, ultimately help the court if those countries that are members, European countries in particular, stand by it.
And as you say, doing what it's supposed to do. The president of the ICC, though, describing all of this as a turning point in history, saying the future of humanity itself is under threat. And she insists that the court will remain independent and impartial. But is it seen as being independent and impartial? How effective is it actually? Well,
the ICC has had a somewhat difficult time since it was set up. By its nature, because it's you know, indicting people who are guilty of these serious crimes and going and going after those most responsible. Often it is intervening in situations which are quite political. And it has, although it's set up with some independent powers, it can receive, can have cases referred from the Security Council. So the Security Council can tell it to intervene in certain situations. And of course, many of the countries around the world that are most influential are not part of it. So one of the reasons why it came under a lot of scrutiny in the beginning was that all of the first investigations and all of the first people against whom there were arrest warrants and all of the first people who went on trial were from Africa. And so the perception was growing that this was a court basically for trying people from the global south, from Africa, and it couldn't touch people from the most powerful countries. And that's why I think it's really important now that the court has issued arrest warrants against the Prime Minister of Israel, the state which is a close Western ally. It's important for the court's credibility that those countries that are members of the court should not back away now. And we've seen, as your report referenced, already some, I would say, ambiguous comments from a number of European governments. I think it's really vital that they uphold the court and support its independence at this time.
And have you been surprised by the reaction here in Europe, particularly in France?
Well, I wasn't completely surprised by the reaction in Hungary. We know that Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán likes to provoke the international community and set himself up as an opponent of international institutions. He's the only European leader who said outright that his country would not enforce the warrants. The French statement, if you look at it, was a little more ambivalent. It did say that the French Foreign Ministry believes that that Netanyahu has immunity, diplomatic immunity as a head of government, and that would have to be taken into account in any decision about proceeding with an arrest warrant. But the statement did not explicitly say that they would not arrest him. And ultimately, I believe, according to the French Code of Criminal Procedure, this would be something for a court to decide. So, I think there was a degree of political posturing in the statement that the French government issued. It was designed to, curry favor, really, with Israel's prime minister without kind of committing themselves to something which they couldn't promise. So I think in that way, it was, ultimately not changing things, but at the same time, an unhelpful statement that does, I think, a little bit undermine the appearance of support for the court. And that's regrettable.
And Anthony, issuing those arrest warrants is one thing, but how difficult is it to enforce them? Member states don't always apply, as we saw in Mongolia when Vladimir Putin was there in September.
That's right. And of course, the court has no police force of its own. It is entirely dependent on the cooperation of states that are part of the court to execute those warrants. And we have seen in previous cases, and most recently, as you say, with Vladimir Putin in Mongolia, cases where the warrants don't get enforced. And yet overall, I think if you look at, President Putin's travels since the arrest warrant was issued, we've seen him twice not go to, major international summits in South Africa and in Brazil, where he feared that he might be arrested because those states are party to the ICC statute. And similarly, I don't think we'll see Prime Minister Netanyahu traveling to Europe anytime soon. I don't think he'll even be going to France to test the solidity of that rather ambiguous statement from the French Foreign Ministry. So in practical terms, the effect is not only whether these leaders are actually arrested, but it's also, I think, whether they have to significantly change their behavior and curtail their travels and to some degree step back from the kind of international role that they're used to playing because of the impact that arrest warrant might have.
And Anthony, with some US Republicans at the moment calling for sanctions against the court, what particular challenges is it going to face under Donald Trump in a few months' time?
Well, I think it's very likely that we'll see sanctions from the US against some of the court's senior officials. In fact, last time that Donald Trump was in the White House, there were sanctions against the then chief prosecutor and a couple of other court officials. And that was only because the court was going ahead with an investigation into the situation in Afghanistan that could potentially have resulted in charges against Americans. Now the court has gone further and issued this arrest warrant for Israel's prime minister, and I think it's highly likely we'll see sanctions. We've already had a pretty clear indication from the man that Trump has named as his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, that he is going to go after the court when he takes up that position. And I think, it's obviously going to be very difficult for the court if they're facing sanctions, if they are unable to go to America, if potentially their financial transactions have to be conducted in currencies other than the dollar. All of this is going to be very difficult for the court. And I think an even more serious question is whether the United States also tries to put pressure on some of US allies, European countries and others, to sort of step back, to withhold their support, potentially to not fund the court. I mean, I hope that if we see anything like that, European countries would stand solidly behind the court. But the US, of course, is a powerful country. And if it really launches a major campaign, that could cause a lot of ructions.
Lots of uncertainty then in the months ahead, Anthony. We'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Anthony Dworkin, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. That is it from us for now.